The river gave something back that year. After 3 days of torrential rain, the Tensaw burst its banks and unearthed what Alabama had tried to forget. 23 carved stones arranged in a perfect half-circle beneath the mud. Each bore a name that never appeared in any church record. Locals called it the choir pit. Soldiers clearing debris said the stones faced east, as if waiting for a dawn that never came. Beneath them lay rusted shackles and fragments of cloth, tangled together like drowned prayers. Official records dismissed it as a collapsed chapel foundation. But one soldier wrote home that night. This was no church. These were baptisms that went wrong. If history itself tried to hide this place, why did the river choose to remember? Tell me what you think. Should buried sins remain beneath the water, or do they deserve to surface? Stay with me, because before the flood, there was a preacher, and a plan he believed was holy. The river mist had not yet burned off when Reverend Elias Corbin first stepped from the coach and onto the red earth of Tall Pine Parish. He carried little: his Bible, a tin cup, a letter of appointment with a wax seal. But he walked like a man, promised a purpose. The path wound past cypress knees and water that pooled the color of tea. The chorus of insects seemed to hush as he reached the ridge that overlooked the Blackwood estate. It rose from the bluff like a courthouse turned toward judgment. 4 columns, paint weathered to chalk, windows shut as if the house refused to breathe. Below, smoke drifted from the cookhouse and from the brick sheds along the river. A line of cabins, chalk white doorframes catching the morning, stretched into a neat grid. Beyond them, an old chapel leaned slightly, as if listening for an answer that never came. Nathaniel Blackwood greeted the new preacher with the gravity of a magistrate and the polish of a benefactor. "You'll find we hold to scripture here," he said, offering a hand that smelled faintly of tobacco leaf. "We demand no more than obedience and promise no less than grace. You will help us maintain both." Corbin nodded, grateful for work after months of itinerant preaching and uncertain meals. At sunset, he held an outdoor service beneath the live oaks. The lanterns were hung low, their wicks turned small, and the enslaved families stood in careful ranks, faces half-shadowed. Corbin's voice carried the measured cadence he had learned at seminary as he spoke from John, of water and spirit, of being born again. Yet the moment he said water, a child flinched. A woman's hand tightened around a boy's shoulder until the knuckles showed like pebbles in moonlight. When Corbin finished, no one spoke. A wind moved through the trees and left a sound like pages turning. On his way back to the quarters that night, he passed a low hill facing the river. A rough wooden cross had been driven into the ground there, the earth around it dark and newly turned. He asked an overseer what grave it marked. The man kept walking. "Sinner washed clean," he said, as if the words required no further explanation. Blackwood poured him whiskey from a cut-glass decanter and spoke of domestic order and salvific discipline. He spoke of the covenant his household kept, a partnership between land, faith, and those placed in our care. Corbin recognized the scriptural phrases: stewardship, correction, sanctification. He had preached them himself to families in smaller parishes, but never had those words sounded so heavy, as if they were shackled to an unspoken meaning. In the morning, he visited the chapel. Dust lay thick on the pews, hymnals warped by humidity. A single spider thread ran from the pulpit to the altar rail, as if stitching them shut. Corbin opened the Bible that lay there and found the ribbon marker pressed against a verse about rivers and judgment. "The floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice." He did not yet understand why it felt like a warning. That evening, he again heard the phrase from an overseer passing the cookhouse: "Washed clean." It followed him like a bell that never stopped ringing, and when he lay down, the river's wide breath kept time with that phrase until sleep finally took him. Washed clean, washed clean, washed clean. He would learn soon enough that in this parish, baptism did not always mean new life. Sometimes, it meant silence. He bought the little book from a peddler who came down the river half drunk and sunburned, its calfskin cover already scuffed like something that had been handled hard. Corbin told himself it would be a sermon notebook. After the first ceremony, it became something else, a place to say what could not be prayed aloud. The first entry was spare. This house names fear as faith. The second tried to make a system of the unspeakable, a column for names, another for the moon's phase. A third, for the level of the river, measured against a cypress mark at the bend, where he should have written drowned. He drew a small cross. Next to baptism, a teardrop. Where the page demanded a location, he wrote only East Bank, below the chapel. He began with what he knew. Ruth, indigo dyer, voice true cross. Jonah, field hand cross. Moses, cook's assistant, accused of stealing corn cross. In the margin, he wrote the words he could not let go. Baptism must include breath. Without breath, water is not sacrament, only weight. He tested new ways of speaking so that, should the book be found, mercy might survive the reading. Cleansing by compulsion, he wrote once, the words making his hand shake, sanctification by submersion. He felt his theology fray. He added lines that were not doctrine but plea. Lord, if I stand silent, I stand at the river with them. On nights when the river swelled, he dreamed of it moving like a lung. He woke with his jaw aching from holding back words. The next day, he stood beside Blackwood at a fence line while the planter discussed cotton rot and rat poison with an overseer. The man spoke of yields and losses, of waste made holy. Such arithmetic left Corbin feeling as though the ground itself were listing beneath him. A week later, after another night of forced washing, he wrote a sentence he did not cross out, murder spoken in the grammar of grace. He hid the journal beneath a floorboard. No one stepped on an old carpenter's trick, learned from a deacon in a mountain parish. He placed a psalter on top of the loose board, as if a hymn could weigh down the truth. Every entry made the book heavier. He began to imagine the day he would not be able to move it at all. Yet the book steadied him too. It gave shape to dread. It let him anchor each loss to place and hour, so names would not be carried off by time. Somewhere between scripture and record, his calling shifted. If I cannot absolve, I must remember. The sentence felt both thin and absolute, a rope he held even as the river pulled. When Blackwood praised him for his faithful assistance, Corbin looked at the planter's ringed hands and said nothing. In his pocket, the journal warmed against his thigh like a coal that would not go out. It arrived one afternoon in a tin lockbox, carried by a boy in a livery too large for him. Blackwood waited in his study with the windows shut and the curtains drawn despite the heat. He removed the papers as if unveiling a relic. Our household rule, he said, so there is no confusion. The Covenant of the River was not large, perhaps 20 pages, but it had the density of iron. It braided scripture with inventory, salvation with ledger lines, a soul in custody. Each person was called, their names reduced to initials. Beside each age, skill, temperament, offenses imagined or recorded, and a final column titled, State of Sanctification. The rules were written in the tone of sermon notes. Water is the mark of correction. To compel obedience is to direct a soul toward God. The baptized remain upon the land that sanctified them. Dissent from the covenant is rebellion against divine order. He had even copied verses in the margins to seal each doctrine in ink, as if citation might make it holy. It was law cosplaying as liturgy, and in the gaps between its sentences, Corbin saw the shape of every night he had stood at the river with his throat locked. Visiting planters came to hear Blackwood speak. They sat in leather-backed chairs while he explained how discipline had been transformed into devotion. Where the world sees punishment, he said, we see sacrament. The body resists, the soul learns. Heads nodded. Some took notes. A young heir laughed too loudly, and then stopped when he realized Corbin was watching. Blackwood's teenage son lingered in doorways, absorbing the procedure like a new language. He learned when to fetch the rope, when to fetch the book, when to pace while his father quoted Isaiah. Once, after a baptism, the boy held the covenant against his chest and declared, with teenage solemnity, "We do God's work." Corbin's stomach turned as if he had swallowed salt water. When the Reverend cautiously challenged a line, "Water compels obedience," Blackwood leaned back, patient as a chess player. "You'd rather the lash? This is mercy." He smiled, as if surprised that the preacher did not applaud. "You mistake tenderness for sin, Elias." Late that night, Corbin entered a single sentence into his journal, a line he knew he would recognize even if the page burned. He has given sin a Bible and called it home. After that, he stopped arguing with Blackwood. He watched instead. He counted. He marked the moon and the wind and the way the river sometimes thudded, as if it too had a heart. And when the boy clapped softly again in the dark, Corbin understood the covenant's most grievous clause was unwritten. Teach the next generation to feel nothing. Before her name became a cross in his book, Ruth colored the world. She worked with indigo vats that stained her palms blue as river dusk, stirring with a wooden paddle and humming when the dye breathed, the way dyers said it did, as cloth rose from the liquid, green, then turned to blue when it met the air. Color needs air to tell the truth, she told a girl once. Corbin overheard and wrote the sentence down like a proverb. She sang to the cloth as if it were a child. Sometimes she sang in a tongue that braided English with something older. Sometimes she sang hymns she had learned from her mother. Sometimes it was nothing more than a melody that moved like water, finding its level. The workers listened without seeming to. Even the foreman kept his voice down near the dye house, as if volume might tear the song. The accusation came so small, it seemed designed to be believed. 2 scraps of dyed fabric tucked under Ruth's apron. They said she meant to make a cradle cloth. The overseer called it theft. Blackwood called it insolence. He announced a private sacrament. The euphemism scraped Corbin's ears raw. That night, heat hung low like a lid over the river. The air tasted of iron and magnolia sap. The current moved with a heavy patience. Blackwood recited from the covenant. Corbin spoke a verse he did not feel, words wobbling like light on water. Ruth stood bareheaded, wrists bound in front. Her belly rounded the fabric of her shift, the color of old linen. "Do I go alone?" she asked, and Corbin knew she was asking the question he had asked every night in silence. He shook his head once. Not doctrine, not comfort, simply truth. No one goes alone. Then sing, preacher. His voice failed. She did not wait. She began her river slow hymn, the melody she used to coax indigo from green to blue. River wide and river slow, take me where I need to go. Rain threatened but did not come. When the water reached her waist, she fell silent and lifted her chin as if to listen better. Corbin whispered forgiveness and mercy and words that should have opened a gate. Blackwood signaled. 2 men waded forward. Corbin looked away, not out of cowardice, he told himself later, but because he began to fear that to watch would make him complicit, to witness would make him priest to a lie. He waited for the splash that did not come, for the breath that did not break the surface. The river kept its voice. He wrote after midnight by the light of a stubbed candle. She sang the dye into color. She sang herself toward God. If heaven did not answer, perhaps the water did. In the days that followed, the dye house kept working, but no one sang. Cloth rose from the vats, the color of bruise and dusk, and Corbin felt that every garment sewn from that dye would carry a memory of a song stopped mid-phrase, of a prayer that continued underwater, where words could not follow. Sometimes he wondered if faith could be resurrected by grief, if the only way his belief could live again was by exposing what had killed it. The thought frightened him. He wrote it down anyway. Winter remade the parish into a spare geometry of bone trees and cold water. The chapel's roof thudded with acorns. Corbin's sermons thinned until they sounded like notes copied wrong, each sentence unfinished. He stopped preaching from the pulpit and began walking the grounds at night. A lamp turned low, as if the river might say something it would not say in daylight. That was when he heard the whisper meetings, low hums at first, barely above the water's breath. He followed the sound to a hollow of pines where a circle of people stood around ash that glowed like small stars. A woman traced a pattern in dirt that looked like a map. An old man clapped a rhythm that did not match a hymn book, but matched the human heart. They sang scripture backward, turning bondage into warning, warning into promise. Let my people go, though the river won't part. Our feet will learn the floor of it. Wash me if you must. I will rise the color I was born. Corbin remained at the edge of the dark. He did not step into the firelight. Listening is a kind of kneeling, he wrote later. The meeting shifted from chant to story, story to prayer, prayer to silence. In the silence, he felt the weight of names he had recorded, the unfixed words that clung to him like silt. He took the journal from his coat and, with a piece of coal, copied as faithfully as he could the fragments of song. When the old man's skin like river bark, eyes clear, approached him, Corbin expected a blow or a curse. Instead, the man said, "You hear us now, preacher." His voice held no heat, only measure. Yes. Good. We do not need your prayers. The man nodded toward the circle. We need your witness. Corbin breathed as if a band around his chest had loosened. I can write, he said. Then write the names, the man answered. Write the water beside them. Write who made the water god. Is B Crossin. From then on, the journal changed shape. Hymn fragments coiled beside river heights. The covenant's phrases were copied and then crossed out. Names were written without initials. He began a list he knew would never be complete. Ruth, Isaiah, Moses, Hannah, and left space after each for the date the river might give them back. He slept little. He ate less. The overseers began to say the preacher had gone strange. Perhaps he had, but that strangeness gave him a spine. The next time Blackwood praised obedience from the veranda, Corbin looked at the river and felt, for the first time in months, something like the beginning of a yes to the truth. By midsummer, heat pressed the fields into a kind of quiet fury. Corbin's patience had thinned into resolve. He copied his notes into a clean hand, composed a letter as formal as a deposition, and addressed it to the Diocese of Mobile. He wrote what a faithful man would not want written of his parish: ritual drownings disguised as sacrament, a covenant that equated ownership with salvation, a family training its heirs to clap at silence. He sealed the letter with wax and prayer. He paid a rider 3 days' wages to take it straight through. He stood at the fence and watched until the horse and the dust and the chance of relief were gone. 3 nights later, Blackwood held the opened letter between 2 fingers, like a dead thing fetched from water. Elias, he said with slippery civility, you must learn to preach to those who can hear you. He tapped the page as if disciplining a child. You wrote to men who eat at my table. Corbin felt the room tilt. You cannot bless this. Bless? Blackwood smiled without warmth. I regulate. I sanctify. I do the work you are too delicate to do. His tone softened to the kind used with the inexperienced. A household needs 1 book. Here, that book is mine. On Sunday, at the riverbank where so many nights had ended in water, Blackwood gathered everyone and handed Corbin a Bible. Preach, he said. The command was as tender as it was deadly. Corbin read from Romans in a voice not his own. He spoke of obedience as if it were love, of authority as if it were virtue. He watched his words fall like stones into a well. The faces before him were clear. Some looked down because looking up would have meant tears. Others held his gaze like mirrors that refused to lie. He wanted to blurt the truth and throw the book into the current, but all he managed was a tremor that ran through the word, salvation. That night he wrote in a hand that wavered, ink pooling where he hesitated. I blessed what should be buried. I placed a robe on violence and called it clean. I used God as a screen. The ceremonies accelerated, as if humiliation had turned a key in a lock. Corbin watched the moon wax, wane, resume, and wrote the heights the river kept, like a pulse. 3.8, 5.6, 4.2. Names filled the margins. He tied a thread through the journal's spine, so it would not split from weight. If I cannot save them, he wrote finally, I will at least refuse to forget. He went to his knees beside the bed and found, in the quiet between the planks, the smallest ember of prayer. Let witness be a blade, if I have no other. The first storm walked in on blue-black legs and did not lift for 5 days. Rain hammered the cypress crowns until the woods smelled like a fresh-cut grave. Paths turned to channels, channels to swales, and the swales to a rope of brown water that dragged fences loose as if they were weeds. From the chapel window, Corbin watched the Tensaw swell until it reached the base of the bluff and began to bite. The river that had always breathed now muttered. It struck the bank with a sound like a shoulder set against a locked door. When the sky finally opened to light, the lower field looked as if a giant spoon had scraped it. A half-buried mound had split and bled loose timbers. Cloth, the iron suggestion of rings. A worker covered his mouth and stepped back. Another woman pulled her child behind her skirt, because even the wind smelled of sorrow. Blackwood, boots polished, rode down and declared the site animal remains, ancient, of no account. He ordered it covered, but Corbin had seen the small cross in the muck, burned black and fused with a stone, as if fire had tried to weld grief shut. He had seen a plank carved with a curve of marks that looked like numbers, his numbers translated into scars. That night, lightning found the chapel steeple as sure as a finger pointing. The cross shattered. Flames opened the roof like a mouth and then closed, choking on rain. When Corbin shouldered through the smoking doorway, heat slicked his skin. He lifted the altar cloth as gently as if it were a body and found beneath it the journal where he had hidden it when he ran from the river one night, too stunned to reach his bed. The book's edges curled, the leather split, ink slurred into black veins across the paper, but the spine held, and so did the intention. Remember. He wrapped it in oilcloth torn from a lantern kit and pressed it to his chest until the heat in the room shifted from danger to ache. The next morning he stood on the veranda and told Blackwood what he would not have dared say before. "The river has brought them up," he said. "You cannot bury them twice." Blackwood smiled, as if humor might be mistaken for mercy. "If your God disapproves, he may attempt another flood. I am too busy to manage every shower." Corbin looked at the water and believed truly, for the first time, that the river would answer that blasphemy in its own time. He went back to the chapel ruins, pried up the altar stone with a borrowed pry bar, and carved a shallow cubby into the sand beneath the foundation. He wrapped his journal and the copy of the covenant he had stolen 2 nights earlier when the house slept. He sealed them in the hollow with wax from half-melted candles and replaced the stone. He began writing a different kind of sermon. He titled it, "The Confession of a Drowning Man." The land dried with a look of exhaustion, the way a face looks after weeping. Corbin rebuilt the chapel walls until they formed a low square that fooled no one. He carved a groove with a chisel beneath the altar for air, so the oilcloth would not sweat. At night, he laid the pages out to cool, whispering the names like beads on a cord. Ruth, Isaiah, Jonas, Moses, Hannah, Pearl, Ben. He copied his final sermon by lamp script, not for the living congregation, but for a future that might read. "I mistook office for obedience," he wrote. "I mistook silence for humility. I baptized a lie and wore my collar like armor." He underlined the next line, until the paper nearly tore. I consented. He set out a plan as clean as an itinerary. Walk to the ferry at Stockton, find a wagon to Mobile, seek out the printer who owed a favor to a circuit preacher, and from there get the pages north by someone who would not sell them for protection. He folded his sermon, tucked his copy of the covenant into a portfolio with a false back, and left a note on the chapel's soot-black wall. If the water will not tell, paper must. Dusk thinned the heat to something almost bearable. He stepped into the chapel to retrieve a travel cloak, and found Nathaniel Blackwood in the doorway as still as a portrait. The planter held a pistol by the grip as if weighing it, then set it on the sill. "A gun is messy," he said mildly, "and you have always preferred a clean scripture." Corbin's mouth was dry. "You cannot stop the river," he said. Blackwood glanced toward the bend. "No," he agreed, "but I can decide what it carries." He nodded toward the door. "Walk with me." They crossed the yard together, like 2 men leaving a meeting. Crickets burned the air with sound. A whippoorwill called, and then swallowed its own voice. At the river, they stood without speaking long enough for the moon to climb out of the trees. Blackwood recited Rule 1 of his covenant. The baptized remain upon the land that sanctified them, in a voice so calm it seemed carried by water. "You will not write again, Elias," he said, "or if you do, you will write where only the fish can read." Corbin stepped forward first. He did not pray. He did not give the river a verse. He only said, "I refuse to be priest to this any longer." Then he dove. The lantern light fractured. The overseers cursed. Someone waded, then halted at the shelf where the river dropped. Blackwood squinted, as if the night had misquoted him. They did not find a body. By dawn, only his Bible floated back, swelled, and faithlessly blanked by water. Blackwood told the parish he had seen the Reverend choose death. At the cabins, no one repeated him. In the whisper meetings, the old man said, "The river sometimes keeps what it wants." Corbin's journal lay under the chapel stone, oiled and sealed and waiting, as if its heartbeat had fallen into rhythm with the current. The world took on a listening hush, the kind that precedes a blow. News of secession trickled in, slow and splintered, but it lit arguments like tinder in county stores and courthouses. Blackwood walked through his fields, quoting lines about nations and righteousness. His hair had silvered. Grief had laid a crease between his eyebrows that had nothing to do with doubt. The chapel ruins became a meeting ground again, not for worship, but for work. Under the pretext of clearing vine and rot, a handful of men dug a shallow trench and lined it with old jars and bundles of rag. They called it the Lantern Place. The name said everything and nothing. It was a plan spoken in materials instead of words. Singing was forbidden. Prayer aloud was forbidden. The river was forbidden. A child asked her mother why. The mother said, "Hush," and hummed the rest of the answer into the child's hair, where rules could not follow. When news arrived of the son killed at Bull Run, Blackwood began pacing the veranda at night with a decanter and a Bible, preaching to the columns, "The Lord will refine us by fire." He rasped to no one and to everyone. It was the closest he had come to confessing that water had refused him. A July storm dragged a spine of lightning over the ridge. The workers went to their cabins early and did not fasten their shutters tight. After midnight, the wind shifted. Down in the trench behind the chapel, rags found flame as surely as if they had been praying for it. The first tongues of fire licked up the dry grass, and then the cane. No one could later agree who saw it first. Some said a woman carrying water to a fevered child noticed the glow and set down her bucket without spilling. Others said an old man at prayer stood and gave a nod to no one. Flame moved like a hymn that knew its own chorus. Sheds flared. Cotton bales bloomed into heat. The main house held as long as stone holds breath, then exhaled window glass in a sound like bells breaking. Men ran with blankets. Horses jerked their halters and bucked free. An overseer cursed and then put his hands on his knees and wept when he realized he had said God's name like a plea. Where was Blackwood? Some swore they saw him on the eastern lawn, coat off, holding his Bible high against the rain. Others said he stumbled toward the river, shouting that God would take his house back stone by stone. A woman at the cabins remembered only that the music of the fire sounded almost like singing. By morning, the columns were char and heat. The Lantern Place burned down to jars that cracked in the cooling. The chapel's broken roof had fallen inward, leaving the altar stone to steam in a kind of secular benediction. Underneath, the oilcloth parcel endured, a dry island under a drowned sky. Late that day, after the smoke thinned enough to make breathing possible, 2 men pried up the altar stone with a fence post and found the hollow. Inside, a book and a sheaf that smelled like old tallow. The top page had blackened edges, and one legible line in a neat, soldierly hand: "When the river forgets, the fire will remember." They placed the parcel back, resealed the stone, and said nothing. Some truths needed time for teeth. War had begun, but the parish's trial had already been held. The sentence, if there was one, was that memory would not obey the men who had tried to govern it. When the fighting finished and the uniforms turned from blue to work grey again, the Army Corps sent survey teams south to measure what the war and the storms had rearranged. Captain Elijah Rains arrived with chain, stakes, notebooks, and a habit of listening before he spoke. He had studied divinity before maps, a footnote in his file that made his sergeant call him Padre until the joke wore thin. The Blackwood place appeared on no new map. The plank road now bent wide, as if cartographers had absorbed the land's preference for being left alone. Rains's men hacked through willow thickets to the bluff and found ruins that wore vines like shawls. The chapel's rectangle remained, low and stubborn. They cleared driftwood along the east bend and struck stone flat, deliberate, arranged in a crescent, like pews, facing a pulpit that was only river. Carvings looked like weathered notches until a private rubbed silt from one and said, startled, a name. Another stone bore a different name. A third carried a symbol that could have been an eye, or a fish, or both. Rains recorded each in a tight hand. The foundation beneath the stones had been tied into the bank, with cedar beams now the color of dark tea. Iron rings sat like punctuation halfway swallowed by mud. He had the men lift by hand rather than pry, and he told them to keep their jokes low. When the charred packet surfaced, a clutch of pages in oilcloth, edges eating themselves. Rains catalogued it as handwritten religious material, origin uncertain. He read the first line that had survived the flood and heat. This is the confession of Reverend Elias Corbin. He felt the small hairs along his forearm rise, as if the air had grown colder. Bury the rest, his sergeant asked, uncomfortable with stones that looked like seats. No, Rains said. Mark it. Photograph it if we can. The camera failed twice. The plates fogged. He replaced instruction with a note in his field book, something a superior would call subjective, and a country grandmother would call precise. This place hums. The old woman who approached at dusk carried herself as if time owed her interest. Leave it be, she said, not unkindly. River won't keep quiet if you teach it to talk wrong. Rains respected boundaries he could not explain in reports. He sealed the packet, labeled the crate, and sent it with the supply wagon to Montgomery. When he reached the depot, the manifest signed for it. Weeks later, the archive replied that no such parcel had arrived. Paper has more ways to vanish than men. Rains filed the incident under miscellaneous flood damage and wrote nothing that would make him a figure of fun at officers' gatherings. Then he wrote a second account, quieter, and placed it in the pocket of his Bible on the train north. It stayed there until libraries forgot to ask for it. The file drawer squealed like a sparrow caught in a hinge. Miriam Holt, 24, hair pinned with plain stubbornness, had been assigned to catalogue agricultural circulars, but kept finding herself tugged toward the odd and misfiled. The brown folder marked Surveys, 60 seconds, rattled with the wrong weight. Inside, a field report that smelled faintly of creosote, a sketch of a crescent of stones, and a half-charred sermon leaf with a steadier hand than any farmer's receipt. She copied the legible words onto onion skin with a narrow pen, so the ghost of the original rode under the new lines. Baptism, covenant, Ruth, flood, confession. Numbers followed names like shy companions. 4.6, 5.1, 5.7. She tried to force them into dates and found they refused to obey. Her boarder's husband had been a riverman. He kept an old hydrograph rolled in a tube behind the wash basin. Miriam brought it to the archive after hours and laid tracing paper over it. She plotted Corbyn's numbers against years she could approximate from the fragmentary entries and from Raines's careful notations. The pattern that rose from her pencil was as elegant as music. A curve that climbed after long rain and sank in drought. A second that matched spring runoff. A third that matched the record of a year locals still called the Bad Flood. Not dates, she said aloud to no one. Depths. She labeled the graph Blood River Curve because the title made her hands cold when she wrote it. It felt true in the way that mathematics sometimes feels like grief tamed. Her supervisor hovered, aware of budgets and utilities. Folk legend, he said, and suggested she file it under local color. Miriam smiled, filed the papers where he said, and made carbon copies that she did not log. She mailed one to a small journal that printed sermons and county histories side by side. Her article came out crammed between a piece on hog cholera and the minutes of a Methodist conference. No one wrote to praise or scold, but a pastor in Bay Minette folded the journal into his pocket after reading and carried it to a women's circle. A choir director in Mobile underlined Ruth and taught the phrase, "Water take me home" to sopranos as a humming warm-up. At a baptism in a little church on a creek, an elder said, "Not all water is holy, but all water remembers." Requests for Corbyn's full journal met with polite refusals or legal phrases that felt like doors. One letter came back stamped restricted material. Another bore, in red pencil, a sentence that tried to be a benediction and failed. Let the river rest. On the flyleaf of her own notebook, Miriam wrote the line that most refused to let her rest. The water remembers everything. We just forget how to read it. She died in 1961, 2 years before men marched on Washington, and 3 before they marched across a bridge not many miles from the river she had plotted like a pulse. In her effects, a niece found the carbon copy of the Blood River Curve, a lock of hair that was probably her mother's, and a scrap of blue cloth so faded it could have been sky. The new bridge arched like a sermon that had learned to stand. Cars crossed with radios bright as tin, carrying news from Selma and Montgomery, from Memphis and D.C. Below, the Tensaw made its older news the slow way. They came on a Saturday with folding chairs and bundled flowers. A mason brought bricks he'd salvaged from a collapsed smokehouse. A teacher brought a crate of young magnolias with their roots packed in damp burlap. Children chased dragonflies and were called back with gentle hands. Evelyn Carter walked last, cane tapping time. She wore a dress the color of dusk and carried a piece of cloth, the blue of deep water. "My mother's mother dyed it," she told a reporter who misheard, and wrote grandmother died young before crossing it out. They said she sang. They cleared a patch of ground where the stones had been seen years before, east-facing. Because dawn is a promise, even when you've learned not to trust promises. They laid the bricks in a low curve and set the marker flush with the earth, so floodwater might pass over and not snatch it. The mason pressed the chisel gently, for those baptized against their will. A young pastor spoke a short prayer that did not tidy anything up. He read a line from a letter by a woman named Miriam, "The water remembers," and then nodded to Evelyn. "If you would." She tied the blue cloth to a sapling. It caught the light, like a note held until the right time to let it go. She drew breath through ribs that had learned the prairie of age and began, thin at first, then filling, river wide and river slow. Voices found her. Tenor, alto, a child singing a fourth, above where adults dared. The melody walked down to the low note together and sat there, steady. Birds paused, even the busy noise from the bridge softened. After, they brought food from baskets and told stories that stitched names to years. Someone had a photocopy of the Blood River curve and passed it hand to hand until the grease of pie smudged it human. A young man traced the line with his finger and said, "It looks like breathing." No one corrected him. A photographer knelt for angles that respected bones. The paper ran the picture small, as if afraid of what large would mean, but on the refrigerator doors of the people who had stood there, the photographs took up whole squares of magneted kingdom. Before they left, Evelyn looked at the river and said, not loudly, "She don't forget." It sounded like both warning and blessing. The wind braided itself around the saplings and let the blue cloth point east. They left the ground tidier than they found it, the way you do with a grave you love. Storm years return the way a refrain does. In 1992, the Gulf sent up weather that walked inland, and Saturday, the river rose and kept on rising until it wore a crown of drift. When at last, the water fell back from its banks, two fishermen in a flatboat drifted over something that clicked against the hull like teeth. Stones. Not the rough scatter of river rock, but flat, shouldered, arranged 23 of them in a tidy crescent. The men drew their hands over the tops and pushed silt aside. The stones were carved as if by a patient knife lines. Circles, a mark that looked like an eye and a tear becoming the same thing. Word traveled to the courthouse, then to a university lab, where a graduate student with a degree in underwater archaeology saw an excuse to get wet. They came with slates and measuring tapes and bright optimism that life had not taught caution yet. The divers descended and found beneath the top course a lattice of wood that had not entirely surrendered. Pegs like knuckles, joints that still held their shape. Iron loops flickered in and out of sand like punctuation in wind-blown text. The graduate student surfaced and said through chattering teeth, "It's not natural. It's built to face east." She did not say congregation until a night later when a heron stepped across the shallows like a sexton. Floodlights flattened the shore into theatre. The divers went down again and reported that the carvings echoed notations from an old article they had found on microfilm, a thing called the Blood River curve that plotted height against time. The diver from Mobile, hair slicked tight to her skull, ran a gloved finger along a groove and felt she knew the number even before she wrote it on the slate. As the lights hummed, the water took on a reflective insistence. Seen from the bank, it looked as if pale figures stood waist-deep in rows, not moving, faces turned toward where the sun would be. This was light trick, lens flare, stress. Memory explanations bloomed easy as pondweed. Still, a young researcher cried behind his clipboard and pretended it was the mosquitoes. By morning, a shift in current had erased the stones again beneath a clean sheet of silt. The surveyor began a new field log on which he wrote, "Against training and without apology." Voices heard at low tide. Harmonic, possibly human. He closed the book, looked east, and felt no need to tell the courthouse much more than erosion. Those who saw it said the shape of the crescent matched the breath of the river in a way that made their ribs ache. A choir arranged to sing a dawn that never finished arriving. Even now, if you stand on the bridge at the hour the day exhales, you can hear it. The river lying back into its banks with the patient sound of work long done and never finished. Wind slips through cypress needles, slips between stones, slips into the hollows men made, and then forgot. The water folds the past into its present as easily as current folds around a log. Not triumph, not tragedy, but custody. Hikers come with bottled water and phones bright as minnows. Students come with permits and a desire to name. Elders come with quiet. The river meets them all with the same syllabus. Look, listen, leave a little better. If you watch the surface long enough, reflections resolve into almost faces, almost bodies. A congregation of light standing where stone once made a promise. Not every year brings a flood. Not every flood brings a revelation. But each rise takes a layer. Each fall gives a clue. An initial, the color of old iron on a buried ring. A shard of wood that still smells faintly of pitch. A page rinsed to the ghost of handwriting. The river is not a generous archivist. It gives back what memory requires, not what curiosity demands. On the east bank, magnolias planted by grandchildren have grown tall enough to remember shade from before the war. Families still come on certain anniversaries and tie strips of blue cloth to branches. Children ask why blue. Their elders answer, because a woman who sang made color from breath, and because the sky is blue when the river keeps its peace. The children nod as if this explains everything, which, for once, it does. The marker that lies flush with the soil reads the same as it did the day the masons set it. For those baptized against their will, the smaller line beneath has weathered until the Latin must be traced with a fingertip to be sure. Aqua testis est. The water is witness. It is the simplest theology the place can bear. If a choir gathers under your ribs when the wind comes up, do not be embarrassed. If you hear a hum you cannot assign to insects, do not call a friend to joke. If your throat thickens at a line of song you did not know you knew river wide and river slow, let it. Some pulses are meant to be felt, not fixed. Histories written in dust blow away. Histories written in water persist by repetition. The river does not forgive or forget. It repeats until we learn the tune and the words together. Some nights, its voice is only the soft arithmetic of eddies. Other nights, it gives you breath back on a silver plate. Wade in the water, the old song says, and a child somewhere hears only invitation, not warning. Stand there until the light changes. Tie a ribbon. Name a name. Say nothing if words feel like trespass. The river is busy remembering. It will do the talking in its own time. Pulse, hush, pulse. When someone asks what this place is, tell them not a mystery and not a miracle, but a ledger that learned to sing. Tell them the truth we owe is simple, to read what the water writes, to refuse to forget the names it carries, and to leave the shore in better order than we found it. Because the river is never done baptizing the truth. And because at dusk, if you listen closely, you can hear the chorus tuning up, the faintest rise and fall. Not voices exactly, but something shaped like breath. Wade in the water, children. God's gonna trouble the water.